Chapter 15. Though she'd never admit it, Celaena didn't really know what to expect at their first test. With all the training over the past 5 days and fiddling with various weapons and techniques, her body ached. Which was another thing she'd never admit, even though hiding the throbbing pain in her limbs was nearly impossible. As Celaena and Cale entered the giant sparring room in the morning, she glanced at her competitors and remembered she wasn't the only one who hadn't a clue what to expect. A towering black curtain had been swept across half of the room, blocking the other half from sight. Whatever lay beyond that curtain, she realized, was to decide the fate of one of them. The normal ruckus had been replaced by a rustling quiet, and rather than mill about, the competitors lingered by their trainers' sides. She kept close to Cale, which wasn't a change from the ordinary. But the sponsors atop the mezzanine looking over the black and white checkered floor were. Her throat tightened as her gaze met with that of the Crown Prince. Aside from sending her his books, she hadn't seen or heard from him since the meeting with the king. He flashed her a grin, those sapphire eyes gleaming in the morning light. She offered him a tight smile in return and quickly looked away. Brullo stood by the curtain, a scarred hand upon his sword, and Celaena studied the scene. Someone stepped to her side. She knew who it was before he spoke. "It's a bit dramatic, don't you think?" She glanced sidelong at Nox. Cale tensed next to her, and she could feel him watching the thief closely, no doubt wondering if she and Nox were formulating some escape plan that would include the deaths of every member of the royal family. After 5 days of mindless training, she replied quietly, all too aware that very few people were speaking in the hall. "I'm glad for a bit of excitement." Nox laughed under his breath. "What do you think it is?" She shrugged, heaping her attention on the curtain. More and more competitors were arriving, and soon the clock would strike 9, the time when the test would begin. Even if she knew what was behind the curtain, she certainly wouldn't help him. "Hopefully it's a pack of man-eating wolves that we have to take on with our bare hands." She looked at him fully now, a half-smile in her lips. "Wouldn't that be fun?" Cale suddenly cleared his throat. Now was not the time for talking. She stuffed her hands into the pockets of her black pants. "Best of luck," she said to Nox, before she strode toward the curtain, Cale following her. When they were far enough away, she asked under her breath, "No idea what's behind that curtain?" Cale shook his head. She adjusted the thick leather belt slung low across her hips. It was the kind of belt intended to bear the weight of multiple weapons. Its lightness now only reminded her of what she'd lost and what she had to gain. The death of the Eye-Eater yesterday had been fortunate in one aspect: one less man to compete with. She glanced up at Dorian. He could probably see what was behind the curtain from his place on the mezzanine. Why not help her cheat a little? She flicked her attention to the other sponsors, noblemen in fine clothing, and ground her teeth at the sight of Parrington. He smirked as he watched Kane, who was stretching out his muscular arms. Had he already told Kane what was beyond the curtain? Brullo cleared his throat. "Attention now," he called to them. All of the competitors tried to look calm as he strode to the center of the curtain. "Your first test has arrived." He grinned broadly, as if whatever the curtain concealed was going to torment the hell out of them. "As His Majesty has ordered, one of you will be eliminated today, one of you will be deemed unworthy. Just get on with it." She thought, her jaw clenched tight. As if he'd read her thoughts, Brullo snapped his fingers, and a guard standing by the wall pulled the curtain back. Inch by inch, it swayed away, until Celaena bit down her laugh. "Archery?" "It was an archery contest?" "Rules are simple," Brullo said. Behind him, 5 targets were staggered at various distances through the hall. "You get 5 shots, 1 per target." The one with the worst aim goes home. Some competitors began murmuring, but it was all she could do to keep from beaming. Unfortunately, Kane didn't bother to hide his triumphant grin. Why couldn't he have been the champion who was found dead? You'll go one at a time, Brollo said, and behind them a pair of soldiers rolled out a cart of bows and quivers loaded with arrows. Form a line at the table to determine your order. The test begins now. She expected them to rush to the long table stacked with identical bows and arrows, but apparently none of the 21 other competitors were in much of a hurry to go home. Celaena made to join the forming line, but Cale grasped her shoulder. Don't show off, he warned. She smiled sweetly and pried his fingers off her. I'll try not to, she purred. And joined the line. It was an enormous leap of faith to give them arrows, even if the tips were blunted. A dull head wouldn't stop it from going through Parrington's throat or Dorian's, if she wanted. Though the thought was entertaining, she kept her attention on the competitors. With 22 champions and 5 shots each, the test took a dreadfully long time. Thanks to Cale pulling her aside, she'd been in the back off the line, not dead last, but 3 from the end. Far enough back that she had to watch everyone else go before her, including Kane. The other competitors did well enough. The giant circular targets were composed of 5 colored rings, yellow marking the center, with only a tiny black to mark the bullseye. Each target got smaller the farther back it was placed, and because the room was so long, the final target was nearly 70 yards away. Celaena ran her fingers along the smooth curve of her U-bow. Archery was one of the first skills Arabin had taught her, a staple of any assassin's training. 2 of the assassins further proved it with easy, skilled shots. Though they didn't hit the bullseyes, and their shots got sloppier the farther the target, whoever their masters had been, they'd known what they were teaching. Pelaer, the gangly assassin, wasn't yet strong enough to manage a longbow, and barely made any shots. When he finished, his eyes gleaming with resentment, the champions sniggered, and Kane laughed the loudest. Brollo's face was grim. Didn't anyone ever teach you how to use a bow, boy? Pelaer lifted his head, glaring at the weapons master with surprising brazenness. I'm more skilled in poisons. Poisons. Brollo threw his hands up. The king wants a champion, and you couldn't shoot a cow in a pasture. The weapons master waved Pelaer off. The other champions laughed again, and Celaena wanted nothing more than to smile with them. But Pelaer took a shuddering breath, his shoulders relaxing, and joined the other finished competitors. If he wound up being eliminated, where would they bring him? To prison or some other hellhole? Despite herself, Celaena felt badly for the boy. His shots hadn't been that bad. It was Nox, actually, who surprised her most, with 3 bullseyes into the nearer targets and the 2 final shots along the border of the inner ring. Perhaps she should consider him for an ally. From the way the other competitors watched him as he strode to the back of the room, she knew they were thinking the same thing. Grave, the repulsive assassin, did fine, she supposed. 4 bullseyes, and the final shot right on the border of the innermost ring. But then Kane stepped up too. The white line painted at the back of the room, drew back his U-bow, his black ring glinting, and fired. Again, and again, and again, within the span of a few seconds. And when the sound of his final shot stopped echoing in the suddenly silent chamber, Celaena's stomach turned over. 5 bullseyes. Her one consolation was that none of them had been on that black, the absolute center. One had come close, though. For some reason, the line started moving quickly. All she could think about was Kane getting applauded by Parrington, Kane getting clapped on the back by Brollo, Kane getting all of that praise and attention, not because he was a mountain of muscle, but because he actually deserved it. Suddenly, Celaena found herself standing at the white line, looking at the vast length of the room before her. Some of the men chuckled, albeit quietly, and she kept her head held high as she reached over her shoulder for an arrow and knocked it into her bow. They'd done some archery practice a few days earlier, and she'd been excellent. Or, as excellent as she could be without attracting attention. And she'd killed men from longer shots than the farthest target. Clean shots, too. Right through the throat. She tried to swallow, but her mouth was dry. I am Celaena Sardothien, a Darlan's assassin. If these men knew who I was, they'd stop laughing. I am Celaena Sardothien. I am going to win. I will not be afraid. She pulled back her bow, the sore muscles in her arm aching with the effort. She shut out noise, shut out movement, shut out anything other than the sound of her breathing as her focus narrowed on the first target. She took a steady breath. As she exhaled, she let the arrow fly. Bullseye. The tightness in her stomach abated, and she sighed through her nose. It wasn't an absolute bullseye, but she hadn't been aiming for it, anyway. Some men stopped laughing, but she paid them no heed as she knocked another arrow and fired at the second target. She aimed for the edge of the innermost ring, which she hit with deadly precision. She could have made an entire circle of arrows, if she'd wanted. And if she'd had enough ammunition. She got another bullseye on the third target, aiming for the edge, but landing within the border. She did the same for the fourth target, but aimed for the opposite side of the bullseye. Where she aimed, the arrow met its mark. As she reached for her last arrow, she heard one of the competitors, a red-haired mercenary named Renaud, snigger. She clenched her bow tightly enough for the wood to groan, and pulled back her final shot. The target was little more than a blur of color, so far back that its bullseye was a grain of sand in the vastness of the room. She couldn't see the little dot in its center that no one had yet to touch, even Cain. Celaena's arm trembled with effort as she pulled the string back a bit farther and fired. The arrow hit the absolute center, obliterating the black dot. They stopped, laughing. No one said anything to her when she stalked away from the line and tossed her bow back onto the cart. Cale only scowled at her. Obviously, she hadn't been that inconspicuous, but Dorian smiled. She sighed and joined the competitors waiting for the competition to finish, keeping well away from all of them. When their marks were compared by Brollo himself, one of the army soldiers, not young Pelaire, wound up being eliminated. But though she hadn't lost by any means, Celaena could not stand the feeling that she hadn't really won anything at all. Chapter 16. Despite her attempt to keep her breathing steady, Celaena gasped for air as Sharon beside Cale in the game park. If he was winded, he didn't show it, other than the gleam of sweat on his face and the dampness of his white shirt. They ran toward a hill, its top still shrouded in morning mist. Her legs buckled at the side of the incline, and her stomach rose in her throat. Celaena let out a loud gasp to get Cale's attention before she slowed to a stop, and braced her hands against a tree trunk. She took a shuddering breath, holding on tightly to the tree as she vomited. She hated the warmth of the tears that leaked from her eyes, but couldn't wipe them away as she heaved again, gagging. Cale stood nearby, just watching. She leaned her brow into her upper arm, calming her breathing, willing her body toes. It had been 3 days since the first test, 10 since her arrival in Rifthold, and she was still horribly out of shape. The next elimination was in 4 days, and though training had resumed as usual, she had started waking up a little earlier than normal. She would not lose to Cain, or Renaud, or any of them. Done? Cale asked. She lifted her head to give him a withering glare, but everything spun, dragging her down with it, and she retched again. I told you not to eat before we left. Are you done being smug? Are you done vomiting your guts up? For the time being, she snapped. Perhaps I won't be so courteous next time, and I'll just vomit all over you instead. If you can catch me, he said with a half-smile. She wanted to punch the smirk off his face, but as she took a step, her knees shook, and she put her hands against the tree again, waiting for the retching tourneau. Out of the corner of her eye she saw him looking at her back, most of which was exposed by her damp, white undershirt. She stood. Are you enjoying looking at my scars? He sucked on his lower lip for a moment. When did you get those? She knew he meant the 3 enormous lines that ran down her back. When do you think? She said. He didn't reply, and she looked up at the canopy of leaves above them. A morning breeze sent them all shuddering, ripping a few from where they clung to the skeletal branches. Those 3, I received my first day in Endevier. What did you do to deserve it? Deserve it? She laughed sharply. No one deserves to be whipped like an animal. He opened his mouth, but she cut him off. I arrived in Endevier, and they dragged me into the center of the camp, and tied me between the whipping posts. 21 lashes. She stared at him without entirely seeing him as the gray sky turned into the bleakness of Endevier, and the hiss of the wind became the sighing of slaves. That was before I had befriended any of the other slaves, and I spent that first night wondering if I would make it until morning, if my back would become infected, or if I would bleed out and die before I knew what was happening. No one helped you? Only in the morning. A young woman slipped me a tin of sal while we were waiting in line for breakfast. I never got to thank her. Later that day, 4 overseers raped and killed her. She clenched her hands into fists as her eyes stung. The day I snapped, I stopped by their section of the mines to repay them for what they did to her. Something frozen rushed through her veins. They died too quickly. But you were a woman in Endevier, Cale said, his voice rough and quiet. No one ever, he trailed off, unable to form the word. She gave him a slow, bitter smile. They were afraid of me to begin with. And after the day I almost touched the wall, none of them dared to come too close to home. But if one guard tried to get too friendly, well, he'd become the example that reminded the others I could easily snap again if I felt like it. The wind stirred around them, ripping strands of hair from her braid. She didn't need to voice her other suspicion that perhaps somehow Arabin had bribed the guards in Endevier for her safety. We each survive in our own way. Celaena didn't quite understand the softness in the look he gave her as he nodded. She only stared at him for a moment longer before she burst into a run, up toward the hill where the first rays of sunshine began to peek through. The following afternoon, the champions stood gathered around Brolo, who lectured them on different weapons and other nonsense she'd learned years ago and didn't need to hear again. She was just contemplating whether she could sleep while standing up when, from the corner of her eye, a sudden movement by the balcony doors caught her attention. Celaena turned just in time to see one of the larger champions, one of the discharged soldiers, shove a nearby guard, knocking him to the ground. The guard's head hit the marble with a crack. Andy was instantly unconscious. She didn't dare to move, none of the champions did, as the man hurtled toward the door, toward the gardens and escape. But Cale and his men moved so fast that the fleeing champion didn't have time to touch the glass door before an arrow went clean through his throat. Silence fell, and half of the guards encircled the champions, hands on their swords, while the others, Cale included, rushed to the dead champion and fallen guard. Bows groaned as the archers on the mezzanine pulled their strings taut. Celaena kept still, as did Nox, who was standing close beside her. One wrong movement and a spooked guard could kill her. Even Cain didn't breathe too deeply. Through the wall of champions, guards, and their weapons, Celaena beheld Cale kneeling by the unconscious guard. No one touched the fallen champion, who lay face down, his hands still outstretched toward the glass door. Sven had been his name, though she didn't know why he'd been expelled from the army. Gods above, Nox breathed, so softly that his lips barely moved. They just killed him. She thought about telling him to shut up, but even snapping at him seemed risky. Some of the other champions were murmuring to each other, but no one dared to take a step. I knew they were serious about not letting us leave, but, Nox swore, and she felt him glance sidelong at her. I was granted immunity by my sponsor. He tracked me down and said I wouldn't go top reason if I lost the competition. At that point, she knew he was speaking Moretto himself, and when she didn't respond, Nox stopped talking. She stared and stared at the dead champion. What had made Sven risk it? And why here, right now? There were still 3 days until their second test. What had made this moment so special? The day she snapped at Endevier, she hadn't been thinking about freedom. No, she'd picked the time and place, and started swinging. She'd never meant to escape. The sunlight shone through the doors, illuminating the champion splattered blood like stained glass. Maybe he'd realized he had no chance of winning, and that this kind of death was far better than returning to whatever place he'd come from. If he'd wanted to escape, he would have waited until dark, when he was away from everyone at competition. Sven had wanted to prove a point, she understood, and understood only because of that day she had come within a fingertip of touching the wall at Endevier. A Darlin could take their freedom, it could destroy their lives and beat and break and whip them, it could force them into ridiculous contests, but, criminal or not, they were still human. Dying rather than playing in the king's game was the only choice left to him. Still staring at his outstretched hand, forever pointing toward an unreachable horizon, Celaena said a silent prayer for the dead champion, and wished him well. Chapter 17. With heavy eyelids, Dorian Havillard tried not to slouch as he sat upon his throne. Music and chatter flitted through the air, wooing him to sleep. Why must his mother insist on his attending court? Even the weekly afternoon visit was too much. But it was better than studying the corpse of the Eye-Eater, which Cale had spent the past few days investigating. He'd worry about that later if it became an issue. Which it wouldn't, if Cale was looking into it. It had probably just been a drunken brawl. And then there was the champion who'd tried to escape this afternoon. Dorian shuddered at the thought of what it must have been like to witness it, and at the mess Cale had to deal with, from the injured soldier to the sponsor who'd lost his champion to the dead man himself. What had his father been thinking when he decided to host this contest? Dorian glanced at his mother, seated on a throne beside his own. She certainly didn't know anything about it, and probably would have been horrified if she knew what kind of criminals were living under her roof. His mother was still beautiful, though her face was a bit wrinkled and cracked with powder, and her auburn hair had a few silver streaks. Today she was swathed in yards of forest green velvet and floating scarves and shawls of gold, and her crown upheld a sparkling veil that gave Dorian the distinct impression she was wearing a tent upon her head. Before them, the nobility strutted across the floor of the court, gossiping, scheming, seducing. An orchestra played minuets in a corner, and servants slipped through the gathered nobles in a dance of their own as they refilled and cleared plates and cups and silverware. Dorian felt like an ornament. Of course, he was wearing an outfit of his mother's choosing, sent to him this morning, a vest of dark bluish-green velvet, with almost ridiculously billowy white sleeves bursting from the blue and white striped shoulders. The pants, mercifully, were light gray, though his chestnut suede boots looked too new for masculine pride. "Dorian, my dear," You're sulking. He gave Queen Georgina an apologetic grin. I received a letter from Holland. He sends his love. Did he say anything of interest? Only that he loathes school and wishes to come home. He says that every letter. The Queen of Adarlan sighed. If your father didn't prevent me, I'd have him home. He's better off at school. When it came to Holland, the farther away he was, the better. Georgina surveyed her son. You were better behaved. You never disobeyed your tutors. Oh, my poor Holland. When I am dead, you'll care for him, won't you? Dead? Mother, you're only. I know how old I am. She waved a ring-encrusted hand. Which is why you must marry. And soon. Marry? Dorian ground his teeth. Marry whom? Dorian, you are the crown prince. And already 19, at that. Do you wish to become king and die without an heir so Holland can take the throne? He didn't answer. I thought so. After a moment, she said, there are plenty of young women who might make a good wife. Though a princess would be preferred. There are no princesses left, he said a bit sharply. Except for the Princess Nehemia. She laughed and put a hand on his. Oh. Don't worry. I wouldn't force you to marry her. I'm surprised your father allows for her to still bear the title. The impetuous, haughty girl, do you know she refused to wear the dress I sent her? I'm sure the princess has her reasons, Dorian said warily, disgusted by his mother's unspoken prejudice. I've only spoken to her once, but she seemed lively. Then perhaps you shall marry her. His mother laughed again before he could respond. Dorian smiled weakly. He still couldn't figure out why his father had granted the King of Islewey's request that his daughter visit their court to become better acquainted with the ways of Adarlan. As far as ambassadors went, Nehemia wasn't exactly the best choice. Not when he'd heard rumors of her support of the Islewey rebels and her efforts to shut down the labor camp at Calaculla. Dorian couldn't blame her for that, though, not after he'd seen the horror that was Endevier, and the destruction it had wrought upon Celaena Sardothien's body, but his father never did anything without a reason, and from the few words exchanged with Nehemia, he couldn't help but wonder if she had her own motivations in coming here, too. It's a pity that Lady Celaena has an agreement with Duke Parrington, his mother went on. She's such a beautiful girl, and so polite. Perhaps she has a sister. Dorian crossed his arms, swallowing his repulsion. Celaena stood at the far end of the court, and he was all too aware of her eyes creeping over every inch of him. He shifted in his seat, his tailbone aching from sitting for so long. What about Elise? The Queen said, indicating a blonde young woman clad in lavender. She's very beautiful. And can be quite playful. As I've already learned. Elise bores me, he said. Oh, Dorian. She put a hand over her heart. You're not about to inform me that you wish to marry for love, are you? Love does not guarantee a successful marriage. He was bored. Bored of these women, bored of these cavaliers who masqueraded as companions, bored of everything. He'd hoped his journey to Endevier would quell that boredom, and that he'd be glad to return home, but he found home to be the same. The same ladies still looked at him with pleading eyes, the same serving girls still winked at him, the same councilman still slipped pieces of potential legislation under his door with hopeful notes. And his father would always be preoccupied with conquest, and wouldn't stop until every continent bore Adarlan's flag. Even gambling over the so-called champions had become achingly dull. It was clear Cain and Celaena would ultimately face each other, and until then, well, the other champions weren't worth his time. You're sulking again. Are you upset over something, my pet? Have you heard from Rosamund? My poor child, how she broke your heart. The queen shook her head. Though it was over a year ago, he didn't reply. He didn't want to think about Rosamund or about the boorish husband she'd left him for. Some nobles started dancing, weaving in and out among each other. Many were his age, but he somehow felt as if there existed a vast distance between them. He didn't feel older, nor did he feel any wiser, but rather he felt. He felt as if there were something inside him that didn't fit in with their merriment, with their willing ignorance of the world outside the castle. It went beyond his title. He had enjoyed their company early in his adolescence, but it had become apparent that he'd always be a step away. The worst of it was that they didn't seem to notice he was different, or that he felt different. Were it not for Cale, he would have felt immensely lonely. Well, his mother said, snapping her ivory fingers at one of her ladies in waiting, I'm sure your father has you busy, but when you find a moment to bother thinking of me, and the fate of your kingdom, look through this. His mother's lady curtsied as she extended to him a folded piece of paper, stamped with his mother's blood-red seal. Dorian ripped it open, and his stomach twisted. At the long line of names. All ladies of noble blood, all of marriageable age. What is this? He demanded, fighting the urge to rip up the paper. She gave him a winning smile. A list of potential brides. Any one of them would be suitable to take the crown. And all, I've been told, are quite capable of producing heirs. Dorian stuffed the list of names into the pocket of his vest. The restlessness within him would not cease. I'll think about it, he said, and before she could reply, he stepped from the awning-covered podium. Immediately, 5 young women flocked to him and began asking him to dance, how he fared, if he would attend the Samhain ball. Around and around their words circled, and Dorian stared at them blankly. What were their names? He peered over their jewel-encrusted heads to find the path to the door. He'd suffocate if he remained here for too long. With only polite goodbyes, the crown prince strode from the jangle and jingle of the court, the list of would-be brides burning a hole through his clothes and straight into his skin. Dorian put his hands in his pockets as he strode down the halls of the castle. The kennels were empty, the dogs were at the track. He'd wished to inspect one of the pregnant hounds, though he knew it was impossible to predict the outcome of the litter until she gave birth. He hoped the pups would be pure, but their mother had a tendency to escape from her pen. She was his fastest, but he'd never been able to quell the wildness within her. He didn't really know where he was going now, he just needed to walk. Anywhere. Dorian loosened the top button on his vest. The clash of swords echoed from an open doorway, and he paused. He faced the champion's training room, and even though training was supposed to be over by now, there she was. Her golden hair shone as she wove in and out of a knot of 3 guards, her sword little more than a steel extension of her hand. She didn't balk at the guards as she dodged and twirled around them. Someone began clapping to the left, and the 4 dueling figures stopped. Panting. Dorian watched a grin spread across the assassin's face as she beheld Source. The sheen of sweat illuminated her high cheekbones, and her blue eyes sparkled. Yes, she was truly lovely. But Princess Nehemia approached, clapping. She was clad not in her usual white gown, but rather in a dark tunic and loose trousers, and she clutched an ornatelli-carved wooden staff in one hand. The princess clasped the assassin on the shoulder, and said something to the girl that made her laugh. Dorian looked around. Where was Cale or Brullo? Why was a Darlan's assassin here with the Princess of Islewey? And with a sword. This could not go on, especially after that champion's attempted escape the other day. Dorian approached, and smiled at the princess as he bowed. Nehemia only deigned to give him a terse nod. Not surprising. Dorian took Celaena's hand. It smelled of metal and sweat, but he kissed it anyway, raising his eyes to her face as he did so. Lady Lillian, he muttered onto her skin. Your Highness, she said, trying to pull her hand from his. But Dorian held fast to her calloused palm. Might I have a word, he said, leading her away before she could agree. When they were out of hearing distance, he demanded, Where's Cale? She crossed her arms. Is this any way to speak to your beloved champion? He frowned. Where is he? I don't know. If I were to bet, though, I'd wager that he's inspecting the eye eater's mangled corpse, or disposing of Sven's body. Besides, Brullo said I could stay here as long as I liked after we were done. I do have another test tomorrow, you know. Of course he knew. Why is Princess Nehemia here? She called on me, and when Philippa told her I was here, she insisted on joining. Apparently, a woman can only go so long without a sword between her hands. She bit her lip. I don't recall you being so talkative. Well, perhaps if you'd taken the time to speak with me, you'd have found me to be so. He snorted, but took the bait, gods damn him. And when would have I spoken to you? You do recall the little fact that we traveled together from Endovier, don't you? And that I've been here for weeks now. I sent you those books, he offered. And did you ever ask me if I had read them? Had she forgotten to whom she was speaking? I've spoken to you once since we've been here. She shrugged and made to turn away. Irritated, but slightly curious, he grabbed her arm. Her turquoise eyes glittered as she stared at his hand, and his heart quickened when her gaze rose to his face. Yes, sweaty as she was beautiful. Aren't you afraid of me? She glanced at his sword belt. Or are you as deft at handling your sword as Captain Westfall? He stepped closer, tightening his grip. Better, he whispered in her ear. There, she was blushing and blinking. Well, she began, but the timing was off. He won. She crossed her arms. Very amusing, Your Highness. He bowed dramatically. I do what I can. But you can't have Princess Nehemia here with you. And why is that? Do you believe I'm going to kill her? Why would I kill the one person in this castle who isn't a babbling idiot? She gave him a look that suggested he was part of the majority. Not to mention, her guards would kill me before I even lifted a hand. It simply can't happen. She's here to learn our customs, not to spar. She's a princess. She can do what she likes. And I suppose you're going to teach her about weaponry? She cocked her head. Perhaps you're just a little bit afraid of me. I'll escort her back to her chambers. She gestured widely for him to pass. Ward help you. He ran a hand through his black hair and approached the princess, who waited for them with a hand on her hip. Your Highness, Dorian said, motioning to her personal guard to join them. I'm afraid we must return you to your chambers. The princess looked behind his shoulder with a raised eyebrow. To his dismay, Celaena began speaking in Aylwi to the princess, who stomped her staff. She hissed something at him. Dorian's skill with the Aylwi language was spotty at best, and the princess spoke too fast for him to understand. Thankfully, the assassin translated. She says you can return to your cushions and dancing, and leave us be, Celaena said. He tried his best to look serious. Tell her it's unacceptable for her to spar. Celaena said something, to which the princess only waved a hand and strode past them and onto the sparring floor. What did you say? Dorian said. I said you volunteered to be her first partner, she said. Well, you don't want to upset the princess. I will not spar with the princess. Would you rather spar with me? Perhaps if we had a private lesson in your chambers, he said smoothly. Tonight. I'll be waiting. She curled her hair around a finger. The princess twirled her staff with strength and precision that made him gulp. Deciding that he didn't feel like having the daylights walloped out of him, he walked to the rack of weapons and selected 2 wooden swords. How about some basic swordplay instead? He asked Nehemia. To his relief, the princess nodded and handed her staff to one of her guards, then took the practice sword Dorian extended to her. Celaena would not make a fool out of him. You stand like this, he said to the princess, taking a defensive stance. Chapter 18. Celaena smiled as she watched the Crown Prince of Adarlan lead the Princess of Islay through the basic steps of fencing. He was charming, she supposed. In an arrogant sort of way. But someone with his title could have been far, far worse. It made her uneasy how he'd made her blush. In fact, he was so attractive that she had difficulty not thinking about how attractive he was, and again wondered why he wasn't married. She sort of wanted to kiss him. She swallowed. She'd been kissed before, of course. By Sam, and often. Enough that she was no stranger to it. But it had been over a year since she'd lost the assassin she'd grown up with. And even though the thought of kissing anyone else had once made her sick, when she saw Dorian. Princess Nehemia lunged, slapping Dorian on the wrist with her sword. Celaena bit down her laughter. He grimaced and rubbed the sword joint, but then smiled as the princess began gloating. Damn him for being so handsome. She leaned against the wall and would have enjoyed the lesson had someone not grabbed her arm hard enough to hurt. What is this? Dragged from the wall, she found herself facing Cale. What is what? What is Dorian doing with her? She shrugged. Sparring? And why are they sparring? Because he volunteered to teach her how to fight? Cale practically shoved her from him as he approached the pair. They stopped, and Dorian followed Cale to a corner. They spoke quickly angrily before Cale came back to Celaena. The guards will take you to your chambers. What? She remembered their conversation on the balcony and frowned. So much for swapping stories. The test is tomorrow, and I need to train. I think you've had enough training for today, it's almost dinner. Your lesson with Brullo ended 2 hours ago. Get some rest, or you'll be useless tomorrow, and no, I don't know what the test will be, so don't bother asking. That's absurd, she cried, and a pinch from Cale kept her voice down. Princess Nehemia cast a worried glance in Celaena's direction, but the assassin waved at her to resume her lesson with the Crown Prince. I'm not going to do anything, you insufferable moron. Are you honestly so blind that you can't see why we can't allow this? Can't allow? You're just afraid of me. Don't flatter yourself. You think I want to go back to Endeavor, she hissed. You think I'm not aware of the fact that if I flee, I'll be hunted down for the rest of my life? You think I don't know why I vomit when you and I run in the morning? My body is a wreck. I need to spend these extra hours here, and you shouldn't punish me for it. I'm not going to pretend to know how a criminal mind works. She threw her hands in the air. You know, I actually felt guilty. Just a little. Guilty. And now I remember why I shouldn't have. I hate sitting around, locked in my room, bored out of my senses. I hate all these guards and nonsense. I hate you telling me to hold back when Brullo sings Kane's praises and I'm just there boring and unnoticed in the middle. I hate being told what I can't do. And I hate you most of all. He tapped his foot on the ground. Are you finished? There was no kindness in Cale's face, and she clicked her tongue as she left, her fists aching to bash his teeth down his throat. Chapter 19. Sitting in a chair near the hearth of the great hall, Celaena watched Duke Parrington converse with Queen Georgina atop her dais. It had been a shame that Dorian had left so quickly an hour ago. She hadn't even had the chance to speak to him. Which was especially irksome, given that she'd spent the better part of the morning dressing for court. Her raven-black hair was neatly coiled around her head, and her skin glowed golden from the subtle shimmering powders she dusted on her face. Though the bindings on her pink and yellow gown crushed her ribs, and the pearls and diamonds around her neck strangled her, she kept her chin high, poised. Dorian had left, but having Parrington show up was an unexpected surprise. The Duke rarely visited court. This had to be important. Celaena rose from her chair by the fire as the Duke bowed to the Queen and strode toward the doors. As she stepped into his path, he paused at the sight offer, his eyes gleaming with a hunger that made her want to cringe. He bowed low. "Milady." "Your Grace," she smiled, forcing all that repulsion down deep, deep, deep. "I hope you're well," he said, offering his arm to lead her out of the hall. She smiled again, taking it. Though he was somewhat rotund, hard muscle lay in the arm beneath her hand. "Very well, thank you." "And yourself?" "I feel I haven't seen you in days and days." "What a wonderful surprise to have you visit the court." Parrington gave her a yellow smile. "I've missed you as well, milady." She tried not to wince as his hairy, meaty fingers rubbed her pristine skin, and instead delicately inclined her head toward him. "I hope Her Majesty was in good health. Was your conversation a pleasant one?" "Oh, it was so dangerous to pry, especially when she was here on his good graces. Meeting him last spring had been a stroke of luck. And convincing him to invite her to court mostly by implying what might await him once she was out of her father's household and without a chaperone hadn't been that difficult. But she wasn't here to simply enjoy the pleasures of the court. No, she was tired of being a minor lady, waiting to be married off to the highest bidder, tired of petty politics and easily manipulated fools. "Her Majesty is quite well, actually," Parrington said, leading Celaena toward her rooms. Her stomach clenched a bit. Though he didn't hide that he wanted her, he hadn't pushed her into bed yet. But with a man like Parrington, who always got what he wanted, she didn't have much time to find a way to avoid owning up to the subtle promise she'd made him earlier that year. "But," the Duke went on, "with a son of marriageable age, she's busy." Celaena kept her face plain, calm, serene. "Can we expect any news of an engagement in the near future?" Another dangerous question. "I certainly hope so," the Duke grumbled, his face darkening beneath his ruddy hair. The jagged scar along his cheek stood out starkly. "Her Majesty already has a list of girls deemed appropriate," the Duke halted, remembering whom he spoke to, and Celaena batted her eyelashes at him. "Oh, I'm quite sorry," she purred. "I didn't mean to pry into the royal household's affairs." She patted his arm, her heart kicking into a full gallop. Dorian had been given a list of appropriate brides? Who was on it? And how could she? No, she'd think of that later. For now, she had to find out who stood between her and the crown. "It's nothing to apologize for," he said, his dark eyes shining. "Come tell me what you've been doing these past few days." "Not much of note. Though I met a very interesting young woman," she said casually, leading him down a window-lined stairway into the glass section of the castle. "A friend of Dorian's, the Lady Lillian," he called her. The Duke went positively rigid. "You met her?" "Oh, yes, she's quite kind." The lie rolled off of her tongue. "When I spoke To her today, she mentioned how much the crown prince likes her. I hope for her sake she was on the queen's list. While she'd wanted some information about Lillian, she hadn't expected this. The Lady Lillian? Of course she isn't. The poor thing. I suspect her heart will be broken. I know it's not my place to pry, she went on, the Duke growing redder and more furious by the moment, but I heard it not an hour ago from Dorian himself that. That what? A thrill went through her at his anger, not anger at her, but at Lillian. At the weapon she'd just had the good fortune to stumble across. That he's very attached to her. Possibly in love with her. That's absurd. It's true. She gave a morose shake of the head. How tragic. Foolish is what it is. The Duke stopped at the end of the hallway that led to Kaltain's room. His anger loosened his tongue. Foolish and daft and impossible. Impossible? Someday I will explain why. A clock chimed, off-kilter, and Parrington turned in its direction. I have a council meeting. He leaned close enough to whisper in her ear, his breath hot and damp against her skin. Perhaps I'll see you tonight? He dragged a hand down her side before he walked away. She watched him go, and when he disappeared, she let out a shuddering sigh. But I could get her close to Dorian. She had to find out who her competition was, but first she had to find a way to get Lillian's claws out of the prince. List or no list, she was a threat. And if the Duke hated her as much as it seemed, she might have powerful allies when the time came to make sure Lillian released her hold on Dorian. Dorian and Cale didn't say much as they walked to dinner in the Great Hall. Princess Nehemia was safely in her chambers, surrounded by her guards. It'd been quickly agreed that while it was foolish of Celaena to spar with the princess, Cale's absence was inexcusable, even with the dead champion to investigate. You seemed rather friendly with Sardothien, Cale said, his voice cold, jealous, are we? Dorian teased. I'm more concerned for your safety. She might be pretty and might impress you with her cleverness, but she's still an assassin, Dorian. You sound like my father. It's common sense. Stay away from her, champion or no. Don't give me orders. I'm only doing it for your safety. Why would she kill me? I think she likes being pampered. If she hasn't attempted to escape or kill anyone, then why would she do it now? He patted his friend on the shoulder. You worry too much. It's my occupation to worry. Then you'll have gray hair before you're 25, and Sardothien certainly will not fall in love with you. What nonsense are you talking? Well, if she does try to escape, which she won't, then she'll break your heart. You'd be forced to throw her in the dungeons, hunt her down, or kill her. Dorian, I don't like her. Sensing his friend's growing irritation, Dorian changed the subject. What? About that dead champion, the Eye-Eater? Any idea yet who did it, or why? Cale's eyes darkened. I've studied it again and again over the past few days. The body was totally destroyed. The color leached from Cale's cheeks, innards scooped out and gone, even the brain was missing. I've sent a message to your father about it, but I'll continue investigating in the meantime. I bet it was just a drunken brawl, Dorian said, though he had been in plenty of brawls himself and had never known anyone to go about removing someone's innards. A trickle of fear formed in the back of Dorian's mind. My father will probably be glad to have the Eye-Eater dead and gone. I hope so. Dorian grinned and put an arm around the captain's shoulders. With you looking into it, I'm sure it'll be solved tomorrow, he said, leading his friend into the dining hall. Chapter 20. Celaena closed her book and sighed. What a terrible ending. She stood from the chair, unsure where she was going, and walked out of her bedroom. She'd been willing to apologize to Cale when he found her sparring with Nehemia that afternoon, but his behavior. She paced through her rooms. He had more important things to do than guard the world's most famous criminal, did he? Shouldn't enjoy being cruel, but hadn't he deserved it? She'd really made a fool out of herself by mentioning the vomiting. And she'd called him all sorts of nasty things. Did he trust her or hate her? Celaena looked at her hands and realized she had wrung them so badly that her fingers were red. How had she gone from the most feared prisoner in Enderveer to this sappy mess? She had greater matters to worry about, like the test tomorrow. And this dead champion. She'd already altered the hinges on all her doors so that they squealed loudly any time they opened. If someone entered her room, she'd know well in advance. And she'd managed to embed some stolen sewing needles into a bar of soap for a makeshift, miniature pike. It was better than nothing, especially if this murderer had a taste for champion blood. She forced her hands to her sides, shaking her unease, and strode into the music and gaming room. She could not play billiards or cards by herself, but Celaena eyed the pianoforte. She used to play. Oh, she'd loved to play, loved music, the way music could break and heal and make everything seem possible and heroic. Carefully, as if approaching a sleeping person, Celaena walked to the large instrument. She pulled out the wooden bench, wincing at the loud scraping sound it made. Folding back the heavy lid, she pushed her feet on the pedals, testing them. She eyed the smooth ivory keys, and then the black keys, which were like the gaps between teeth. She had been good once, perhaps better than good. Arabin Hamel made her play for him whenever they saw each other. She wondered if Arabin knew she was out of the mines. Would he try to free her if he did? She still didn't dare to face the possibility of who might have betrayed her. Things had been such a haze when she'd been captured in 2 weeks. She'd lost Sam and her own freedom, and lost something of herself in those blurry days, too. Sam. What would he make of all this? If he'd been alive when she was captured, he would have had her out of the royal dungeons before the king even got word of her imprisonment. But Sam, like her, had been betrayed, and sometimes the absence of him hit her so hard that she forgot how to breathe. She touched a lower note. It was deep and throbbing, full of sorrow and anger. Gingerly, with one hand, she tapped out a simple, slow melody on the higher keys. Echoes, shreds of memories arising out of the void of her mind. Her rooms were so silent that the music seemed obtrusive. She moved her right hand, playing upon the flats and sharps. It was a piece that she used to play again and again until Arabin would yell at her to play something else. She played accord, then another, added in a few silver notes from her right hand, pushed one C and a pedal, and was gone. The notes burst from her fingers, staggering at first, but then more confidently, as the emotion in the music took over. It was a mournful piece, but it made her into something clean and new. She was surprised that her hands had not forgotten, that somewhere in her mind, after a year of darkness and slavery, music was still alive and breathing. That somewhere, between the notes, Wassam. She forgot about time as she drifted between pieces, voicing the unspeakable, opening old wounds, playing and playing as the sound forgave and saved her. Leaning against the doorway, Dorian stood, utterly transfixed. She'd been playing for some time with her back to him. He wondered when she'd notice him, or if she'd ever stop at all. He wouldn't mind listening forever. He had come here with the intention of embarrassing a snide assassin, and had instead found a young woman pouring her secrets into a pianoforte. Dorian peeled himself from the wall. For all her assassinating experience, she didn't notice him until he sat down on the bench beside her. "You play bow." Her fingers slipped on the keys, which let out a loud, awful clank, and she was halfway to the rack of cue sticks when she beheld him. He could have sworn her eyes were damp. "What are you doing here?" She glanced to the door. Was she planning on using one of those cue sticks against him? "Cale isn't with me," he said with a quick smile. "If that's what you're wondering. I apologize if I interrupted." He wondered at her discomfort as she turned red. It seemed far too human an emotion for a Darlan's assassin. Perhaps his earlier plan to embarrass her wasn't foiled yet. "But you were playing so beautifully that It's fine." She walked toward one of the chairs. He stood, blocking her path. She was of surprisingly average height. He glanced down at her form. Average height aside, her curves were enticing. "What are you doing here?" she repeated. He smiled roguishly. "We decided to meet tonight. Don't you remember? I thought it was a joke. I'm Crown Prince of Adarlan." He sank into a chair before the fire. "I never joke. Are you allowed to be here?" "Allowed?" "Again, I'm a prince. I can do what I like." "Yes, but I'm Adarlan's assassin." He wouldn't be intimidated, even if she could grab that billiards cue and skewer him with it in a matter of seconds. "From your playing, it seems that you're a great deal more than that." "What do you mean?" "Well," he said, trying not to get lost in her strange, lovely eyes, "I don't think anyone who plays like that can be just a criminal." "It seems like you have a soul," he teased. "Of course I have a soul. Everyone has a soul." She was still red. He made her that uncomfortable? He fought his grin. This was too much fun. "How'd you like the books?" "They were very nice," she said quietly. "They were wonderful, actually." "I'm glad." Their eyes met, and she retreated behind the back of the chair. If he didn't know better, he would have thought himself to be the assassin. "How's training going? Any competitors giving you trouble?" "Excellently," she said, but the corners of her mouth drifted downward. "And no. After today, I don't think any of us will be giving anyone any trouble." It took him a moment to realize she was thinking of the competitor who had been killed while trying to escape. She chewed on her bottom lip, quiet for a heartbeat, before she asked, "Did Cale give the order to kill Sven?" "No," he said. "My father commanded all the guards to shoot to kill, if any of you tried to escape." I don't think Cale would ever have given that order, though he wasn't sure why. But the unnerving stillness in her eyes abetted, at least. When she didn't say more, Dorian asked as casually as he could, "On that note, how are you and Cale getting along?" Of course, it was a totally innocent question. She shrugged, and he tried to not read too far into the gesture. "Fine. I think. He hates me a bit, but given his position, I'm not surprised." "Why do you think he hates you?" For some reason, he couldn't bring himself to deny it. "Because I'm an assassin, and he's captain of the guard, forced to belittle himself by minding the would-be king's champion." "Do you wish it were otherwise?" He gave her a lazy grin. That question wasn't so innocent. She inched around the chair, coming closer to him, and his heart jumped a beat. "Well, who wants to be hated? Though I'd rather be hated than invisible, but it makes no difference." She wasn't convincing. "You're lonely?" He said it before he could stop himself. "Lonely?" She shook her head and finally, after all that coaxing, sat down. He fought against the urge to reach across the space between them to see if her hair was as silky as it looked. "No. I can survive well enough on my own if given proper reading material." He looked at the fire, trying not to think about where she'd been only weeks before and what that kind of loneliness might have felt like. There were no books in Endevier. Still, it can't be pleasant to be one's own companion at all times. And what would you do? She laughed. I'd rather not be seen as one of your lovers. And what's wrong with that? I'm already notorious as an assassin. I don't particularly feel like being notorious for sharing your bed. He choked, but she went on. Would you like him to explain why, or is it enough for me to say that I don't take jewels and trinkets as payment for my affection? He snarled. I'm not going to debate morality with an assassin. You kill people for money, you know. Her eyes became hard, and she pointed to the door. You may leave now. You're dismissing me? He didn't know whether to laugh or yell. Shall I summon Cale to see what he thinks? She crossed her arms, knowing she had one. Perhaps she'd also realized that there was fun to be had in riling him, too. Why should I be thrown from your rooms for stating the truth? You just called me little more than a whoremonger. He hadn't had this much fun in ages. Tell me about your life, how you learned to play the pianoforte so masterfully, and what was that piece? It was so sad. Were you thinking about a secret lover? He winked. I practiced. She stood, walking toward the door. And yes, she snapped, I was. You're quite prickly tonight, he said, trailing her. He stopped a foot away. But the space between them felt strangely intimate, especially as he purred, You're not nearly as chatty as you were this afternoon. I'm not some odd commodity that you can gawk at. She stepped closer. I'm not some carnival exhibit, and you won't use me as part of some unfulfilled desire for adventure and excitement. Which is undoubtedly why you chose me to be your champion. His mouth fell open and he conceded a step. What? Was all he managed. She stalked past him and dropped into the armchair. At least she wasn't leaving. Did you honestly think I wouldn't realize why you came here tonight, as someone who gave me the crown of a hero to read, which suggests a rather fanciful mind that yearns for adventure? I don't think you're an adventure, he muttered. Oh. The castle offers so much excitement that the presence of a darling's assassin is nothing unusual? Nothing that would entice a young prince who's been confined to a court all his life? And what does this competition suggest, for that matter? I'm already at your father's disposal. I won't become his Sunchester, too. It was his turn to blush. Had he ever been scolded by anyone like this? His parents and tutors perhaps, but certainly not a young woman. Don't you know who you're talking to? My dear prince, she drawled, examining her nails, you're alone in my rooms. The hallway door is very far away. I can say whatever I wish. He burst out laughing. She sat up and watched him, her head tilted to the side. Her cheeks were flushed, making her blue eyes even brighter. Did she know what he might have wanted to do with her if she wasn't an assassin? I'll go, he said at last, stopping himself from wondering if he could actually risk his father's and Cale's wrath, and what might happen if he decided to damn the consequences. But I'll return. Soon. I'm sure, she said dryly. Good night, Sardothien. He looked around her rooms and grinned. Tell me something before I leave. This mystery lover of yours, he doesn't live in the castle, does he? He instantly knew he'd said the wrong thing when some of the light vanished from her eyes. Good night, she said a bit coldly. Dorian shook his head. I didn't mean to. She just waved him off, looking toward the fire. Understanding his dismissal, he strode to the door, each of his footsteps sounding in the now too silent room. He was almost to the threshold when she spoke, her voice distant. His name was Sam. She was still staring at the fire. Was Sam What happened? She looked at him, smiling sadly. He died. When he got out. He would have never teased her like that, never said a damn word if he'd known. Her words were strangled as she said, 13 months ago. A glimmer of pain flashed across her face, so real and endless that he felt it in his gut. I'm sorry, he breathed. She shrugged, as if it could somehow diminish the grief he still saw in her eyes, shining so bright in the firelight. So am I, she whispered, and faced the fire again. Sensing she was truly done talking this time, Dorian cleared his throat. Good luck at the test tomorrow. She didn't say anything as he left the room. He couldn't banish her heart-wrenching music from his mind, even when he burned his mother's list of eligible maidens, even when he read a book long into the night, even when he finally fell asleep. Chapter 21. Celaena dangled from the stone wall of the castle, her legs trembling as she dug her tar-covered fingers and toes into the cracks between the giant blocks. Brola shouted something at the other 19 remaining champions scaling the castle walls, but from 70 feet up, the wind carried his words away. One of the champions hadn't shown up for the test, and even his guards hadn't known where he went. Maybe he'd actually managed to escape. Risking it seemed better than this miserably stupid test, anyway. She gritted her teeth, inching her hand upward, and pulled herself up another foot. 20 feet up, and about 30 feet away flapped the object of this insane race, a golden flag. The test was simple: climb the castle to where the flag waved 90 feet in the air and retrieve it. First one who grabbed the flag and brought it back down received a pat on the back. Last one to reach the designated spot would be sent back to whatever gutter they came from. Surprisingly, no one had fallen yet, perhaps because the path to the flag was fairly easy. Balconies, windowsills, and trellises covered most of the space. Celaena scooted up another few feet, her fingers aching. Looking down was always a bad idea, even if Arabin had forced her to stand on the ledge of his assassin's keep for hours on end to become accustomed to heights. She panted as she grasped another window ledge and hoisted herself up. It was deep enough that she could crouch within, and she took a moment to study the other competitors. Sure enough, Cain was in the lead, and had taken the easiest path toward the flag, Grave and Varen on his trail, Nox close behind, and Pelaire, the young assassin, not far below him. There were so many competitors following him that their gear often got tangled together. They'd each been given the opportunity to select one object to aid them in their ascent: rope, spikes, special boots, and sure enough, Cain had gone right for the rope. She'd taken a small tin of tar, and as Celaena rose from her crouch in the windowsill, her sticky, black hands and bare feet easily gripped the stone wall. She'd used some rope to strap the tin to her belt, and before she stepped out of the shade of the sill, she rubbed a little more on her palms. Someone gasped below, and she swallowed the urge to glance down. She knew she'd taken a more difficult path, but it was better than fighting off all the competitors taking the easy route. She wouldn't put it past Grave or Varen to shove her off the wall. Her hand suctioned onto the stone, and Celaena heaved herself upward just in time to hear a shriek, a thump, and then silence, followed by the shouting Offenlookers. A competitor had fallen and died. She looked down and beheld the body of Ned Clement, the murderer who'd called himself the Scythe and spent years in the labor camps of Calaculla for his crimes. A shudder went through her. Though the murder of the Eye-Eater had made many of the champions quiet down, the sponsors certainly didn't seem to care that this test might very well kill a few more of them. She shimmied up a drainpipe, her thighs clinging to the iron. Cain hooked his long rope around a leering gargoyle's neck and swung across an expanse of flat wall, landing on a balcony ledge 15 feet below the flag. She fought her frustration as she worked her way up higher and higher, following the course of the drainpipe. The other competitors shuffled along, following Kane's path. There were a few more shouts, and she looked down long enough to see that Grave was causing a backup because he couldn't manage to toss his rope around the gargoyle's neck as Kane had. Varen nudged the assassin aside and moved past him, easily securing his own rope. Nox, now behind Grave, made to do the same, but Grave started cursing at him, and Nox stopped, lifting his hands in a gesture of placation. Smirking, Celaena braced her blackened feet on a stabilizing bracket holding the pipe in place. She'd soon be directly parallel to the flag. And then only 30 feet of bare stone would separate her from it. Celaena eased farther up the pipe, her toes sticking to the metal. 15 feet. Below her pipe, a mercenary was clutching the horns of a gargoyle as he set about fastening his rope around its head. He seemed to be taking the faster route across a cluster of gargoyles. Then he'd have to swing onto a landing 18 feet away, before making his way to the other gargoyles on which Grave and Nox now quarreled. She was in no danger of him trying to scale the drainpipe to bother her. So inch by inch, she moved up, the wind battering her hair this way and that. It was then that she heard Nox shout, and Celaena looked in time to see Grave shove him from their perch atop the gargoyle's back. Nox swung wide, the rope wrapped around his middle going taut as he collided with the castle wall below. Celaena froze, her breath catching as Nox scraped his hands and feet against the stone to catch hold. But Grave wasn't done yet. He bent under the guise of adjusting his boot, and Celaena saw a small dagger glint in the sunlight. How he'd gotten the weapon past his guards was a feat in itself. Celaena's warning cry was carried away by the wind as Grave set about sawing Nox's rope from its tether on the gargoyle. None of the other champions nearby bothered to do anything, though Pelaer paused for a moment before easing around Grave. If Nox died, it was one less competitor, and if they interfered, it might cost them this test. Celaena knew she should keep moving, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Nox couldn't find a hold on the stone wall, and without a nearby ledge or gargoyle to grasp, he had nowhere to go but down. Once the rope broke, he'd fall. One by one, the threads of his rope snapped beneath Grave's dagger, and Nox, sensing the vibrations, looked up at the assassin in horror. If he fell, there was no chance of surviving. A few more slices of Grave's blade and the rope would be severed entirely. The rope groaned. Celaena moved. She slid down the drainpipe, the flesh of her feet and hands tearing open as the metal cut into her skin, but she didn't let herself think of the pain. The mercenary on the gargoyle below only had time to lean into the wall as she slammed onto the creature's head, gripping its horns to steady herself. The mercenary had already tied one end of his climbing rope around the gargoyle's neck. Now she seized it and tied the other around her own waist. The rope was long enough and strong enough, and the 4 gargoyles perched beside hers would provide enough space to run. "Touch this rope and I'll gut you," she warned the mercenary, and readied herself. Nox shouted at Grave, and she dared a look to where the thief dangled. There was a sharp snap of rope breaking, and Nox's cry of fear and rage, and Celaena took off, sprinting across the backs of the 4 gargoyles before she launched herself into the void.